Good morning. It's March 1st. Spring is in the air. And what better way to start the week than by joining us for our first ever Human Capital Trends talk show. My name is Justin Noah. I'm a senior manager in Deloitte's Human Capital Consulting practice. And I've been fortunate to present the Human Capital Trends report in previous years with colleagues who are not here, but we hope are watching today. And today, I will be your host. I'm going to provide you a very quick tour of this year's report, highlighting the key theme, some key findings, and then touching on 4 of the trends. And then we'll sit down to a discussion with our special guests. There will be time for some Q&A, so please feel free to put in your questions into the chat function, and we'll pick those up during the discussion, at the end of the discussion. If you have any reflections, it's a virtual talk show. Please feel free to put your thoughts or comments into the chat function so other viewers are able to reflect on your perspectives. So as Plato wrote in the Socratic Republic, our need will be the real creator. There's another phrase which is necessity is the mother of invention, but we're not going to go further into philosophy today. But that idea of using human strengths such as creativity, flexibility, resilience, courage, judgment, compassion to navigate a crisis, that idea is also essential to supporting organizations' shift from survive mode to thrive mode. And this last year has shown us that organizations need to do more than just survive disruption. They need to employ a mindset to allow them to thrive in the future. And that's really the overarching theme to the report. How can organizations position themselves to thrive? So when it comes to surviving, this mode is really about doing what's necessary to succeed today. And a survival mindset views disruptions as point-in-time crises to be addressed with the expectation that the organization will revert back to business as usual once that crisis is over. In terms of a thrive mindset, however, it's about doing what's possible, not just to succeed today, but also to position yourself to capitalize on tomorrow. So a thrive mindset really recognizes that disruption is continuous. It's not episodic. And it really embraces disruption as a catalyst to drive the organization forward. So that's the overarching theme of the report. I'm now going to touch on 3 key findings from the report itself. So the first key finding is that views of preparedness are shifting from a focus on the familiar to planning for the unknown. As you can see from the bars on the slide there. Prior to COVID, many organizations had no preparedness strategies or were really just focusing on incremental likely events. But post-COVID, the focus has shifted towards multiple scenarios and also focus on high impact events. So shift in focus towards the unknown and towards ongoing disruption. The second key finding is that executives say their organization's ability to navigate future disruptions will rely on distinctly human capabilities. So preparedness for the unexpected depends crucially on an organization's handling of work and the workforce. So the top priority is the ability of their people to adapt, reskill, and assume new roles. The second priority, the ability to organize and manage work in a way that facilitates rapid decision-making. And the third key finding is that executives believe work reimagination will be critical to future success. So before COVID, many organizations were focused really just on optimizing work. But post-COVID, there's been much more of a focus and an emphasis on reimagining work, but more importantly, redesigning work to really sort of think about the new sets of assumptions necessary to enable an organization to prepare for the future and thrive in the future. So those are the three key findings from the report. Very, very quickly, I'm now going to sort of provide a quick overview on 4 of the trends in the report before we move to our discussion with our guests. So the first trend is around well-being. This was the number 1 trend in the report last year. And actually, I should mention that the report this year is really a double click and a deeper dive into the reports from last year. So it's picking up last year's trends and examining how those have developed in the COVID context. And in terms of well-being in the report this year, what was interesting that 7 out of 10 executives said that the shift to remote work had a positive impact on well-being. However, the question that the report poses and what we pose to you is, how can you make that sustainable? Remote work is a part of it, but how can work be redesigned to promote well-being moving forward? And here's where there's an interesting disconnect in the report, because in terms of work transformation, the employees or workers who were surveyed said that well-being was one of the top 3 objectives from well-being. Well-being was one of the top 3 objectives in terms of work transformation. However, executives only put well-being as a second to last outcome of work transformation. So there's a real disconnect between what workers are thinking and expecting from a well-being and work transformation perspective versus what executives are expecting. So trend number 2, beyond reskilling. Last year in 2020, we were really thinking about this in more tactical terms, but we've gained some new insights in terms of how to really unleash worker potential, how to embrace worker agency and give more choice, and also sort of create new and improved talent marketplaces internally, but also externally into your talent ecosystem, perhaps enabled by technology. So you can really use technology to examine the potential in terms of flexibility ranges associated with jobs, such that in a future crisis, a worker or an employee could be redeployed to fit operational gaps more easily. So really seeking to capitalize on worker agency, on worker choice, to unleash that workforce potential. Trend number 3, governing workforce strategies. So in last year's report, the majority of respondents said that they needed additional information on the workforce. But much of that focus was on retrospective data and data based on static events or static workforce profiles. But as organizations shift from planning for likely incremental events in the context of disruption being almost kind of a continuous expectation now, it becomes important that organizations adopt a more dynamic approach to understanding its workforce. So gathering insights to tap into the entire talent ecosystem, to redeploy and deploy people into perhaps new or slightly different roles, and having a holistic view of people's norms, sentiments, and risks, and being able to really sort of understand and capture those insights in a real-time basis versus a retrospective and historical basis. So the 4th trend I'll give you an overview on now, a memo to HR, my favorite trend. And last year was a special report. It was the 10th anniversary of our report. So we provided a kind of a special report that looked back over 10 years of human capital trends. And in the report, we also published an 11th chapter called a Memo to HR. And in that chapter last year, we recognized that HR functions have made great progress over the last decade. And the survey really showed this. We also identified, though, the need for HR to expand and extend its role and its influence, really in recognition of the increasingly complex and dynamic environment. And the report this year is really encouraging because it showed that the proportion of executives who are very confident in HR's ability to navigate future changes, that doubled, and the proportion of executives who are not confident in HR dropped dramatically. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you believe indeed that HR needs to have a new role or to have an extended or expanded influence in the organization? Well, let's find out what our guests think about that. Joining me on the sofa, I'm very happy to have Christina here. Christina, please, for our viewers, welcome. Would you mind introducing yourself, please?
Thank you, Jazz, and good morning, everybody. So my name is Christina. I head up human capital practice in Deloitte Consulting. I've been with Deloitte for almost 2 years now. I have a background in consulting from Coca-Cola, Quartz, now Bain in the Danish market, and previously PA Consulting. And then I have 6.5 years of experience working as head of strategic change, talent, and OD for Arla Foods, which is also, as you will know in a short while, how Lone and I have met each other.
Fantastic. Welcome. Glad to have you here, Christina. And we have Lone Twies joining us from her sofa. Good morning, Lone. Welcome. For our viewers, please, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your current role?
Certainly. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lone Twies, and I currently serve as the CHRO for Grundfos, where I hold full accountability for all aspects of people, organization, and culture. As Christina alluded to, prior to joining Grundfos, I spent 9 years with Arla, and prior to that, 7 years with Danfoss. I've always worked in HR, but have lived and worked both in and outside of Denmark. Super happy to be here with you today.
Thank you so much, and it's nice to have old friends together in our first talk show. Lone, let me start with you, please. Could you tell us how has COVID-19 impacted you and Grundfos?
Yes, certainly. I think like everybody else, it started off as what we thought was a local impact in China. We weren't prepared at all for this to be a global pandemic, but it didn't take long for us to face up to the same things that all other organizations were facing up to, the immense uncertainties, both in terms of keeping our people safe, but also protecting our operational integrity and being able to serve our customers. And at the same time, interestingly enough, we had just announced the ambition to embark on the biggest transformational reorganization of Grundfos in its entire history. So we were navigating these two immense challenges at the same time. So the past year has definitely been a challenging one.
I can imagine that's a lot to contend with. Let's reflect, please, Lorna and Christina, on our trends from this year. So the first trend of well-being. If I could ask you, Lorna, to just reflect how COVID impacted the approach to well-being at Grundfos.
Certainly. I think Grundfos has always had a huge commitment to its people, had a very high degree of awareness around the importance of health and safety. But what COVID did was that it accelerated the attention or the focus on also the aspects of mental health and well-being. So as a large part of our workforce was certainly confined to working from home, we also embraced the importance of addressing health, safety, and well-being in more dimensions than we had before.
Thank you. And which priorities, in your view, had the greatest impact?
So certainly there was this whole protecting of the operational integrity, but the priority around keeping people safe, whether they were going to work as frontline staff or they were staying at home in front of their PCs, really addressing both aspects with relevant initiatives was super important for us. So apart from sort of the screening with tests when that became available for the physical safety, addressing the mental health and well-being through introducing employee resource groups. We also introduced surveys to tap into how people were experiencing the working from home conditions was definitely some of the things that were impactful for us.
Thank you, Lorna. Christina, if I may ask you to reflect or share with our viewers, were there any well-being initiatives or priorities that have caught your eye?
So, excuse me. I think the general trend that we have seen, you also alluded to that, Jazz, in the report, with an increased focus on well-being the past years has definitely been accelerated during COVID. And I think there are 4 general initiatives that we are seeing, an increased focus, as Lona also said, on the mental and physical, obviously, health being of our people. An increased focus also on stress or stress preventive initiative, in particular for the people in the front line who have experienced an increased stress and burnout. Then there are initiatives now that's being initiated also through legislation in terms of ensuring that working from home, if you're doing that you have the office equipment in terms of tables and chairs, etc., that make that comfortable. And thus, fourthly, the ongoing surveying and asking people about their health and well-being, I think is an additional element that we have seen. And in particular, in relation to surveys, we've also seen that with our Deloitte employees. I think we've really seen and are seeing the 4 or 5 generations in the workplace play out for real, because people's needs here are very, very different depending on whether you are young, single with no family, or if you actually have a family and have had to work with your kids being homeschooled. So that's also been extremely interesting to look at.
Super challenging. And if I may follow up and ask, what role have leaders played in this scenario, as far as you're concerned?
Some leaders, funnily enough, I think have coped very well. Some leaders less well, depending on the organization and the culture and the leadership that you normally provide. Now, obviously, in a production environment such as Grundfos, leadership is very visible on the shop floor. In consulting or advisory, such as Deloitte, of course, we're used to working in project-based organizations where everybody is not physically in the office all the time. So leadership is often remote. But I think for a lot of leaders, myself including, the fact that you've been used to working from home and spending your entire workday actually on the screen, of course, has also had a huge impact.
Yeah, thank you. Very, very interesting answers. Thank you so much, and great reflections. I hope you and the audience are benefiting from this, and please do feel free to add your reflections into the chat function. We'd be really happy to hear your thoughts. Lorna, you mentioned the need to sort of tap into sort of the surveys that were being run in Grundfos, and so I want to move us into governing workforce strategies and the whole idea about people analytics. To what extent were you able to draw on kind of new or different kinds of workforce data to enable the COVID response at Grundfos?
So we certainly came to realize that the data we had available on our workforce was very much historic in nature, very much related to sort of distinct employee life cycle event, such as who did we recruit when, when did they leave us, or things like that. And we had this need for establishing something more like continuous listening, tapping in to the sentiments of our staff on a more frequent basis to understand, how were their experience, what could we do to alleviate some of the stress or bridge from what they were used to before and the situation that we found ourselves in now. And our response was this decision to start surveying, simply asking people in a relatively simple format, how were they feeling? And of course, we could have wished for some kind of baseline from what was it like before, right? To really compare and understand that data. But on the other hand, getting that understanding, seeing where we had, for instance, geographical differences, also seeing functional differences in how people were feeling, allowed us to design and target interventions based on that. So super important to make that shift, and something that will definitely influence our approach going forward.
Thank you. And if I could ask, looking back then, are there any data that you wish you had going into the pandemic about your workforce?
So as I said before, maybe a little bit more about the baselining piece. How much were people actually used to working from home? To Christina's point, we're an organization that had adapted the full digital platform to enable virtual ways of working, but to the extent to which the workforce had actually gone down that road, or how comfortable they were with that, could have been helpful for us in assessing or addressing the actual needs for building the relevant skills. What we saw was that particularly leaders found it challenging to translate leadership into the more virtual world. Some of the tools that they had been relying on, or approaches that they had been relying on in the past to be effective, suddenly was just not possible for them to deploy or apply anymore. So that shift and having that understanding prior to going in could have been useful.
Thank you. And Christina, are there any sort of solutions or tools from a workforce strategy perspective or workforce data perspective that you'd like to sort of bring into the dialogue?
Well, I think the whole social listening, or sensing, as Lone calls it here, is definitely an analytical tool and a channel that's here to stay. And in particular in circumstances where you can't wait 3 months or 6 months or 12 months to compare engagement survey to last year, this instantaneous and continuous listening has become more and more important. And actually to make concrete and specific and tangible actions. So I think that's super interesting. We've also seen several vendors, now this is not a commercial show, but ServiceNow, who offers a platform which I'm sure the audience will know for HR service centers or IT service centers. They've also quite quickly developed solutions to actually help enable the coming back into the office and where are people traveling. So I think those kinds of solutions are being developed, and then we have the apps. So in the Danish market, there's the Stop Smitte or Smittestop now, which of course is not a workforce strategy tool as such. It's more sort of a community tool, but the balance between your work life and your private life also becomes a little bit blurred in these circumstances.
Mm. And going off a little bit on a tangent here, I guess the question then arises: to what extent are HR organizations in a position to be able to act upon the data that they are gathering? If there is this expectation to always be listening, I guess there's also then an expectation to see some kind of action as a result of the feedback provided.
Absolutely. It probably links to the memo of HR, which you're going to ask about in a second, I know, but absolutely, I think HR being sort of at the forefront and very often in the epicenter of the decisions that have been made. That's the clear sense I get from various conversations with HR functions and CHROs. So that comes with a huge responsibility. But also a big opportunity, as you shared with the numbers for HR to keep that position going forward, but also to be not just the voice of the organization, but also being and acting responsibly and acting on those insights. That's really, really important.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And you're moving us forward very nicely. But before we get to a memo to HR, I do want to sort of pause for a moment on reskilling and the trend on reskilling. I think, the last year has been really amazing in terms of the kind of the response that we've seen, how people have just shown resilience to adapt and adjust to the circumstances, working in ways which they have not been used to or might have been expected to. So, Lorna, if I could ask you, is there anything in particular from a reskilling perspective that you've been surprised or challenged by during the pandemic?
I've been surprised. If I've been surprised with anything, it has been sort of the willingness of people to really rise to the occasion and just adopt and try to get things to work with or under these new set of circumstances. So I think we've had confirmation that we actually have a quite resilient and agile workforce, but of course there's also been real skill gaps. For instance, in our customer-facing teams, with our sales force, who relied very much on actually going to see the customer, the very physical kind of face-to-face interaction in order to promote sales, understand the client needs, so on and so forth. How do you transform that and learn new ways of working? And I'm still in a place where I wonder if is this an elastic band that we've sort of stretched to its limit, and will it then snap back the minute that becomes possible, or have we actually embraced really new ways of working also in this aspect? At least that's where we're trying to really enable and accelerate our efforts to address this digital mode also in the sales work. And then, as I alluded to before, I think there's the whole leadership aspect. I think our leaders have started thinking differently about the workforce and about their role as leaders. When something like this happens, or during this global pandemic, I think many of our people have embraced the thought that work is not necessarily a place you go. It is what you do. It is also a place, but what should that place then be or enable us to do together?
Very interesting. Thank you very much. Christina, what responses in the marketplace have you seen to tackle the problems associated with reskilling in the context of the pandemic?
So if we look at some of the statistics, now you showed the global report, we also have sort of a Nordic audience. I think of the 6,000 respondents, we had 60 Nordic companies involved. And 55% of those respondents say that the adaptability and the upskilling of the workforce is the top priority over the coming years, but only 25% say that they're prepared for this. And I think that's also, as Lone said, what we have seen here. The digital transformation has definitely been accelerated, and we have seen jobs going back to the home office that we would not have dreamt of. Companies have made investments not only in tables and chairs, but also technology investments for people to work at home. So the big question here thinking about sort of the whole future of work trend that we've also discussed for a number of years now with workforce and workplace, how much of this is going to change. We've seen already big companies making radical decisions to cut down on office spaces. So I think that's the trend that we are seeing in major cities at the moment. That of course then requires the companies to think carefully about what is that new normal that we want to shape and design when we come back. Lone, you called it sort of the rubber band. Do we just want to go back to the old normal, or are we actually taking that opportunity to shape the new normal, which is also the difference, as you put it so nicely, Jazz, between surviving and thriving. And to be quite honest, for the first couple of many months, I think a lot of us have been in survival mode, and it's only after a while that you can actually look ahead, and also with the ongoing challenges that we are seeing. Very sort of in practical terms, we've of course seen a boom in online learning and virtual learning, everything from remote leadership to virtual ways of working to educating employees in tools to work remote and online. As for Deloitte, very early on, we released also a couple of guidelines to help facilitate that and train leaders in that. And I think that's something like that all companies have been doing short term.
Thank you, Christina. You both mentioned actually and touched on leadership a couple of times. So if I might ask you both, maybe perhaps starting with you, Christina, how have you had to change your approach to leadership this last year? What have you found really to be especially challenging?
So of course the informal part of leadership and just being available and being visible in the office has not been a tool or possible for the past year. So as a leader, I've had to find alternative ways of doing that, of course remotely. But we've also, as a company, taken certain measures and initiatives, as I'm sure a lot of other companies also have, to ensure that you do that in a walk and talk. So can be physical if you are only two, but also just actually walking and talking and ensuring that you speak with people on an ongoing basis. We've had several discussions in my leadership team, and it's been top of the agenda, obviously, before the business agenda, the health and then the well-being of our people. And I think the whole notion of health and well-being, from being something that leaders might think they need to do or think about because HR tells them to, I think right now, and what we are seeing is that leaders do take a very active and honest and authentic care about their people and the health of well-being.
Fantastic, thank you for sharing. And the walk and talk idea has really proved to be useful in our daily steps challenge that we've also had. Lone, if I could ask you also, if you wouldn't mind, please reflecting on your own sort of leadership, let's say challenges you've experienced in terms of how you lead.
Sure. I think like many others, I have fallen into the trap of having back-to-back online meetings. It's so easy once you're sat in front of the screen to just keep it going. And to some extent that just enhances the quite transactional nature of work. And to be more intentional about, on the one hand side, like Christina mentioned, the informal aspects, actually slotting in time to allow for informal actions. We currently have in the HR team at Grundfos, we have a constantly open virtual coffee room where people can meet for breaks, like you would if you were at the office and accidentally bumped into colleagues. So being intentional about the informal contact, because otherwise you fall into the trap of transactional in that respect. But the other piece is also being intentional about not just slotting in time to get stuff done, but also whether it's in a walk and talk format or a virtual walk and talk where you walk and talk in separate locations to allow for the more transformational aspects of work, the creativity that comes from being together and the collective intelligence, allowing time also for that, was something that didn't come natural to me at the beginning, because you were in a crisis management mode. There was a lot of things that you needed to get done, but that I realized I needed to set aside time for, be intentional about ensuring that to be part of also my leadership.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lorna. And I think that has moved us very nicely into our last trend, a memo to HR. So Lorna, if I may start with you, please. And you've shared some of this already, but what were the areas of HR's greatest impact during COVID-19? And feel free to also, by the way, share any perspectives you might see from the broader marketplace.
Let me start in the abstract, because I think the pandemic has actually been a dear reminder of what we should really be focusing on in HR. HR, human resources, but maybe the human element is actually the important one, and where we as a function should really be making the difference. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be data-driven in our decision-making or thinking about how technology can enable our ability to get work done and reimagine work, as you call it in the trend report. But I think where we as a function have had the greatest impact, and where I think we should continue to focus, is in focusing on the distinctly human element of organizations.
Fantastic, very, very nicely put, and that's also very much kind of the essence of our report this year and last year. And do you believe, perhaps starting with you again first, Lorna, do you believe HR was bold enough in framing and expanding the scope of the solutions that you were deploying in the face of this disruption?
I think, based on my personal experience, there was definitely this sense that suddenly sort of the headlights were switched quite clearly and distinctly towards the HR function, and allowing us to take lead in how to address this crisis. And for some, that was a welcome opportunity, but at times, for some, including myself, you also felt like, maybe the headlight doesn't have to be, or the focus doesn't have to be on HR all the time. But I think there's something here to pick up on, and really daring to be bold and daring to play that role. And I think what was encouraging for me to see was that there was just an openness and a willingness to let HR play that role. So we were rewarded for being bold and for taking that role under these set of circumstances. So there are learnings for us as a function to take from that, and project ourselves into the future based on that experience.
Thank you. And Christina, in the context of the new normal then, in the context of positioning organizations to move into thrive mode, perhaps with an expectation of ongoing and continual disruption, with perhaps future unlikely events taking place. Do you believe, loaded question, do you believe that HR has the opportunity and need to look beyond the traditional HR role?
Loaded question, Jazz, absolutely. I think there's definitely an opportunity and a need. And the sense I'm getting, Lone, with colleagues, and some of those are absolutely on the call here today amongst the audience, is the spotlight feeling that HR and in particular CHROs have had over the past 12 months. Now, you also need to recover once in a while, so it's fine if the spotlight can go somewhere else. But I would definitely challenge HR to embrace that, because I think, as Lone says, this is what HR as a supporting function should be doing, and hopefully we don't have to deal COVID or other pandemics all the time, but to humanize work and bring that element back into the workforce, and the way that decisions are made based on a combination, of course, of business and people-related decision elements. So absolutely, yes, I think the boldness should stay on. I think in the longer term, HR can probably only be as bold as the senior leadership allows HR to be. But I think there's definitely been a space for HR to pave the way. So let's stay there and help co-create and shape the future also.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for that very interesting discussion. We've made our way through the trends, so we now have an opportunity for some Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
I will ask you both to offer some key takeaways after the Q&A. So you have a few minutes to think about what key takeaways you'd like to leave our viewers with.
Okay.
But let's get to the questions first, and I will see what our audience members have put through. So there's a question, Lone, if I may start with you. Could you please give an example of how you in Grundfos have used insights from your surveys to improve well-being and or leadership?
Sure. If I take the starting point in the "How do you feel?" survey that we introduced in spring last year, face value, it was super encouraging that most of our employees were coping really well with the new set of working conditions, but there was also a clear element that that there were people who were struggling. And part of what they were struggling with, we could using text analysis on their comments, we could clearly distinguish some areas that we could address. One of them being this lack of interaction with colleagues. So that gave us an opportunity to address with relevant interventions that specific element. Establishing resource groups, a specific channel for colleagues to connect, show pictures of their pets, stuff like that I wouldn't have anticipated before. But that kind of thing we wouldn't have come up with if we hadn't done the survey and had identified that these were the things that really mattered to our people.
Thank you. We have another question in here, and please, audience members, please do send your questions in. Perhaps I'll address this question to you, Christina. The question is, we talk about building new skills to tackle the increased virtual working. Being very hands-on, what particular skills have you seen companies focus on, or what would you recommend to focus on?
So virtual ways of working is not a new phenomenon, but I think the way that we've had to practice it over the 12 months has been very, very different. And definitely the feedback that we are getting and what we can see in our responses is a very practical and simple thing that in the old days you could be part of a virtual meeting and you would have one or two of the audiences in the room and a couple outside of the room. Now, rules and guidelines in terms of how do you actually manage a meeting like that and ensure that everybody's involved and included, we've probably all of us been part of that, is just different than in the setup now where everybody has gone virtual. So I think part of the upskilling, of course, is to do with understanding how to use the technical tools. In our line of business, it's not just running meetings. It's also, as Lone alluded to, the creative part of what you actually do when you collaborate with colleagues and when you meet with colleagues in workshops or seminars or trainings, where the physical elements means a lot. So upskilling people in those kinds of workshop tools is something that we've had to do as an organization to cater for that part of the business that we are in. We've also been involved in setting up various kinds of digital academies. So part of it, I think, is part of what you discussed before, just the workforce transformation and the automation as such. But a lot of it is simply to do with ensuring that you can provide the best tools and also be comfortable in the setup that we have working in the virtual world.
Thank you very much. And we have another question here. And Lona, perhaps I could ask you to comment first. Did you feel prepared, or did you need to come up with a whole new strategy to dealing with new ways of working in the context of the pandemic?
I think we were prepared in the sense that the technology platforms, the tools were all there, were all available. But were we prepared to the extent that we had actually enabled all of our workforce to work in that way in an effective and efficient manner? Probably not. But we were ready to press that fast forward button, and I think the conditions also allowed people to lean in and go all in, just trying out, because there was simply no other way of getting things done. And remember, we also did this transformational reorganization. If you had asked me before the pandemic whether that would be possible to do a global reorganization of an organization of 19,000 people, entirely online, based entirely on virtual ways of working, I would have told you no. But nevertheless, we succeeded in that. So whether we were consciously prepared, we probably weren't, but we were prepared in the sense that we eventually made it work, and we succeeded in what for us is a fantastic endeavor in setting up a new organization model.
That's super, thank you. So there's a question here on well-being, and we've already heard from you both about this. But Christina, if I could ask you to answer this question, what is the first step you'd recommend to improve well-being? And there's a rider to the question as to whether there are any sort of concrete tools that you could recommend.
I think the first step actually is to listen in, as Lone says. So not think that you can invent a well-being strategy for your employees if you don't know what are their needs and what is the temperature. And as I said earlier on, we've also done sensing and surveys in Deloitte and found out the big differences between, in particular, our younger colleagues who live in smaller flats than some of the older colleagues with families. And just that difference, how do we actually cater for that, allowing more young people into the office because they would like to, and that they could have that as, of course, a safe and confined space. In terms of well-being, also an important element is in my opinion, not just to make this a leadership task and a top-down driven task. So there's a lot that employees can do on their own and actually work with colleagues to come up with certain initiatives that are the right ones. So I would also say engage your people in designing those initiatives and in activating them.
Great, thank you very much. So there's a question now, and perhaps I could ask you both to comment on this one, about the talent agenda. So the question is, how do you see the future talent agenda being formed based on all of these COVID accelerated changes? So Lona, if I could ask you to comment first, how do you see the future talent agenda being formed as a result of all of these changes?
So I definitely think that that this experience of us all working from home and what I spoke to before about this growing understanding that work is not only a place you go to, but it's something that you do, it is outcomes that you drive, has definitely taught us to think differently about the talent pool and who would be relevant for us to attract, but also retain for us in Grundfos. So it's, for some of our leaders at least, it seems that the blinders have been taken off to some extent, and they're now looking at talent in a more nuanced way than they did before. So I personally hope that this will also be fueling our ambitions on the diversity, equity, and inclusion dimension to allow us to think and address our talent needs with a bit more sort of open mind.
Thanks, Lorna. And Christina, any reflections on the talent agenda and how that will change?
So maybe just building on what you said, Lone, I think the flexibility in terms of what you can provide to your talent, flexible working hours, is definitely sort of a rubber band that I don't think will go back to nothing if you haven't had that as part of your culture. So I think that's there to stay. And then there's the sort of the borderless search for talent, which I definitely also think will push us and companies into ensuring that we get the right fit for a particular position and be more open-minded in terms of where is that person basically located, because that's also what we've seen during COVID, that you can actually hire and fire and start an entirely new job without being in the office. It's maybe not ideal, but that's what we are doing at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. So we have no further questions from the audience. So if I could ask perhaps for you both to share your 3 key takeaways for our viewers, perhaps starting with you, Lorna.
Yeah, so I think my first takeaway is around the whole concept of health, safety, and well-being. Before the pandemic, maybe that was something that we all took for granted. And it was a bit of a duty that you had to attend to if you were a people manager. And I think this has shown us that it is something far beyond that, and that by attending to our health, safety, and well-being, we're not just doing the right thing in terms of sort of a moral obligation, but we're really unleashing a potential that can benefit us and our organizations for the future. Then I think there is an opportunity to be open and look for learning. Just leaning into the experience. We don't need a pandemic to have the confidence to try new things. We should have that appetite as a function and as individuals to simply test, try, learn, and unlearn some of the habits of the past if they're not effective anymore. And my last takeaway is this is such an unparalleled opportunity to either connect or reconnect with your purpose, both at an individual level, but also as an organizational level. Because when you're faced with a crisis or very unpredictable circumstances, that purpose is what will show you the way and guide you to the right place. So those would be my 3 takeaways.
Thank you, Lorna. Christina, if I could ask you to offer some takeaways.
Yes, and now Lone got to go first. So your last takeaway there, Lone, on purpose, I fully echo that. So remember that purpose is the North Star in a world disrupted. Even if as a leader, of course, we tend to focus on the short term, and that's what we did at the beginning of the crisis. I fully agree with you, Lone. The longer that crisis element is there, the more the need we have, and I think we've seen that also for decisions and our people to be guided by the longer purpose of the company. So we should always remember that. Be prepared for next time. So COVID may go away. Hopefully it will go away sooner rather than later. but something else might come in, and it's not necessarily sort of a health pandemic, but it could be something different. So the mindset of actually thinking about scenarios, you also mentioned that, Jazz, and which our report shows that the whole being ahead of the game and actually thinking through what can happen and ensuring that you have sort of a quick response if that happens in the future. Of course, that's related to how you look at risk and how you manage risk overall in the company. And last but not least, back to the boldness of the HR function again to shape that future and to co-create new ways of working with leaders and with the rest of the organization. That would be my 3 remarks.
Fantastic. Some brilliant messages there from you both. Thank you. I think all that's left for me is to thank you both very much for your inputs, your reflections, your comments. Thank you for being patient with the questions. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning into our Human Capital Trends talk show. We will be sending you all an email afterwards with a link to the recording, as well as a link to all of the materials. So thanks again, and wish you all a very good day ahead.